Deep conversations with the right people are priceless, and ideas are formed in the crucible of authentic, connected, and sometimes controversial conversations. No ideas are off the table because why would they be? Join us on Inquisitive Souls as we lead with curiosity, empathy, and a massive heaping of juvenile humor. Join us on this learning journey. All right, before we saddle up, I want to tell you about the Dad Edge Alliance, which is my absolute favorite community on the whole entire internet. It's a group of, at the time of my recording, it's about 250 guys. It's growing all the time, but it is a community unlike anything I've ever seen. And I don't know if you could hear that thunder that just happened, but that is a sign that what I'm saying is truly, truly important. That's right. Thunder. Thunder happened when I'm talking about the Dad Edge Alliance. So listen, if you're a guy and you are feeling like your friendships or your relationships are superficial, you get around, you shoot the shit, but you're never going deeper. You don't feel safe to do that. And you know that there's something more. I'm telling you, join this community. It is insanely life-changing. Okay. Like we got guys in there from all walks of life. But they all have one thing in common. They're trying to elevate fatherhood by improving themselves. They're leaning in. They're supporting each other. They're learning from one another. They're learning about themselves. They're challenging themselves. They're setting goals. They're holding each other accountable. But they are all doing it in a place that's totally safe and totally just overflowing with bro love. And I'm trying to say that in a manly way. Bro love, right? So, one of the things that I've learned throughout my own personal development journey, which is a journey that will last the rest of my life, obviously, is that the people you surround yourself with that's one of the most important choices you can make. Many of you have probably heard the quote, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And when I first heard that, logically, I got it. Okay, that makes sense. But I never could have imagined what it actually meant. How transformative it is to get a better, higher caliber, more open, loving, caring, relentless group of men in your life. So that's what this fucking community provides. I mean, I don't know how to state it in a way that really truly conveys how I feel about it. Maybe I'll just say fuck a lot more. But I mean, the stuff that goes on here is crazy. They've got community calls. They've got accountability teams. They've got amazing content, free books. We're building courses. We have experts come in, New York Times bestselling authors, Navy SEALs to speak to the guys. And the guys are learning and they're growing and they're building relationships with one another and they're bringing a better version of themselves into every aspect of their life. So please think about it. Look around you. Do you have the group of people around you that are going to help you create the fucking life you want? Most people don't. Most people don't even know there's an alternative. And most people don't even understand how important it is. So I'm telling you from my own personal experience and witnessing hundreds of people have the same experience, it changes everything. Okay, so listen, if you want to know more, you can either always send me a message or you can go to gooddadproject.com/alliance and I'll put that link in the show notes page. Do it. And it will help you become emotionally fucking excellent. Now on to the show. Alrighty, we got a treat for you today because I interviewed some super smart dudes who've written a cool new book called The 10 Worlds, The New Psychology of Happiness. And it was such a cool conversation because, first of all, I love talking to people who are so much smarter than me and who have done so much incredible work in the world. And no matter what question I asked them, I would say that they were more than, they had thought through it, right? They were more than prepared and are obviously experts in their field. And so I learned a lot from this conversation because I learned about the definition of happiness. And I learned about all these different they call them core delusions that we struggle under when we're trying to search for happiness. So I highly recommend you read the book. And I know that I certainly love this conversation. And I do love these guys too, because at the end of it, they said that this was one of the best interviews they ever had. And so really, I'm such a cheap date that is pretty much all you need to say in order for me to be a friend for life. But no, I think that, our pursuit of happiness, one of the most potentially fulfilling, and noble quests. I mean, happier people tend to make other people happier or help other people be happier too. And happier people tend to make the world a better place, I would say. But it's a struggle that often seems filled with, running into brick walls, things not turning out, it actually being filled with pain. And as these guys talk about, Alex and Ash, it's really because we're going about it all wrong. And, we want to get to a stage of enlightenment. So I did their quiz, and I come from the world of realization, which is actually fairly high up as far as, not that it's sequential, but I mean, it's one of the 8 worlds, realization. Of course, one of the characteristics is being really into personal growth, but also doing a lot of navel gazing, like insufferable navel gazing. So that's kind of how we opened the podcast. And when I read it, I was like, yeah, that kind of sounds like me to a T. But we have a great conversation about all kinds of things. And I actually learned a lot around the ideas of attachment, which is something, you talk about in Buddhism and stuff. And I've never really understood it or how to be, well, we'll just leave it at that. We talked about attachment, and for me, it was an eye-opening part of the conversation and really helpful. So let me tell you about these guys. So Alex Lickerman is a medical doctor, and he's the former assistant professor of medicine and director of primary care at the University of Chicago. He's been quoted in NPR, Crain, Chicago Business, Playboy. I've never read that magazine. The Chicago Tribune, Men's Health, and the New York Times and Time, and has written for Psychology Today, Crain, Chicago Business, USA Today, Slate, the Huffington Post, and more. His first book is titled The Undefeated Mind, on the Science of Constructing an Indestructible Self. Okay, before I go on to Ash, let's just say I have just a massive inferiority complex right now that I'm going to deal with once I'm done recording this intro. And his sidekick, if I mispronounce this, Ash, I apologize. Ash ElDifrawi is a doctor of psychology and began his career as a clinical psychologist as an inaugural fellow of the renowned Center for Family Health at the University of Chicago. Dr. ElDifrawi is also trained as a forensic examiner, drug abuse counselor, and certified marriage and family therapist. He's also held several teaching positions in social and clinical psychology. After transitioning to a career in marketing, Dr. ElDifrawi has held senior positions at companies including Google, McKinsey, Wrigley, GoGo, and currently Redbox. Dr. ElDifrawi is still a licensed clinical psychologist in Illinois. Jesus. I don't know what to say about that, other than to say these dudes are smart as hell. They've written a good book, and we've had a great conversation, and I'm super grateful to have had the chance to talk to them. So, guys, thanks a lot, and keep up the great work. And for our wonderful audience, enjoy this amazing conversation about how to pursue and find happiness in a way that works. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
I should let you know up front that I'm coming to you from the insufferably self-absorbed world of realization. Yeah, so maybe I need some help. Maybe by the time we're done this conversation, I'll have moved up a couple of worlds. And one thing I wanted you guys to know is, I don't know if you're aware of this, but according to Amazon, people who are looking at your book are very interested in Fitbit products.
That worries me. I'm not sure what that means, but I don't know that.
It worries me more that Amazon makes those connections than anything else.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe it's just trying to influence me. So anyways, let's get right into it. So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you guys is, what made you decide that now was the right time to write a book about happiness? I mean, this is a very saturated space in the marketplace, I guess. So why now, and what was important to you about it?
That's a great question. We didn't really even think about it as why now. We've actually been working on this for 23 years. And so it was a culmination of, we had talked about it enough. We had gone through enough experience with patients and in our own lives had the space and time to finally start writing. And so it was more just, we had reached the end of our investigation and thought, well, it's time to write this thing. So we really didn't time it. We didn't think about that at all. Although I think in retrospect, I think the world is as unhappy a place as it's been in a long time. If you look at even some of the studies and just what's going on around us. So maybe it was well timed.
No, I was just going to add that I actually think the timing is is fortuitous for the reason Alex just said, that just recent research shows that despite all this literature and all this talk about happiness, that people are more unhappy than ever. And I think we feel that's because they've sort of been going about it the wrong way. And we hope this book helps people think about happiness in a different way that might lead them down a better path.
Fantastic. So when you think of happiness, I mean, I imagine that if I was to ask somebody about happiness, I would imagine that half the people would say not feeling like hell. And, other people would have a more positive view of what it means. But when you talk about happiness, what does it mean to you?
We actually spend the majority of the book defining it, because part of the thesis of the book is that what happiness means to people, what they think will make them happy and what they think happiness is, actually varies. And what you happen to believe it is determines actually how happy you can be. That's sort of the core thesis of our book. So in broad terms, I would say happiness is the best good feeling we are capable of having. But exactly what that means and what levels of happiness we can achieve varies from person to person. And we spent a lot of the book delineating the difference between the different types.
Interesting. So why do you think the world is such an unhappy place right now?
Well, we actually talk about that a little bit in the book. And, one of the reasons that we think the world is an unhappy place is because the way we're pursuing happiness is actually flawed. So, in fact, we argue in the book that if you took all the beliefs people have about what happiness is, and you sort of categorize those and slotted them down into their most core, most basic beliefs, they would all come down to 10 core beliefs about what happiness is. And we argue, and this gets to the root of your question, that 9 of those beliefs are actually wrong. And they lead you down a path that might lead you to temporary happiness, but we argue that it's happiness that's very fragile and very fleeting and ultimately won't last. So because of that, we think that the reason is that the world's not an unhappy place because people are going about trying to achieve happiness in the wrong way.
Very interesting. So what are some of you said there's 9 beliefs. What are some of them?
So we call them the core delusions. And one of them, for example, is the core delusion that has people believing that pleasure is happiness, that they're actually equivalent. And this gives rise to the world of animality and has very particular characteristics. But you can imagine, if you really believe that bodily pleasure is happiness, that's the best good feeling you can feel, you will spend your life making decisions that lead you to pursue those things. So this is how people get lost in drugs and alcohol, or addicted to eating, or to other physical pleasures. And while pleasure, of course, is a component of happiness and feels very good when you feel it, a life spent in the pursuit of pleasure for most people ends up being a very unhappy life.
So that's interesting. So is one of the core delusions that happiness is an absence of displeasure, if that's a word, or an absence of pain? Because I would have thought that people who, like when you use the example of eating or drugs, or it wasn't in the pursuit of happiness, I would have thought, or what I've learned, doing this podcast and doing my own research, I mean, oftentimes that's actually trying to avoid pain more than it is to seek happiness.
That's funny. So I think there's 2 aspects of that question. I'll let Alex take one of them, which gets into something we call core affect. But let me address the second part in terms of, and so it's funny because one of the beliefs, or one of the worlds, which is called the Rule of Tranquility, which happens to be the world I'm from. So I'm not quite where you are yet in the world of realization. I'm 3 worlds below you. But that actually comes from the belief that happiness comes from avoiding pain. And so from that perspective, people try to construct their lives in a way to try to avoid very painful emotional experiences or very bad outcomes. They seek peace of mind. But of course, that leads to a tremendous amount of anxiety, because you truly can't really control everything that's going to happen to you. And it's kind of a fruitless pursuit to do so. Plus, we are just very bad at actually predicting what outcomes will and will not make us happy. So we're not very good at figuring out what decisions we make to do that. So again, that's whether it's because you believe pleasure gives you happiness, or whether because you believe that avoiding pain will make you happy, both of those are delusions. And in this case, they actually happen to be delusions of each of the worlds that we talk about. Both will only give rise to a temporary happiness, because you can't, those outcomes, will be fleeting.
But I'd like to address your the other point you raised, which is a really good one, which is that a lot of times people will get lost in drugs and alcohol because they are trying to numb themselves and not feel unpleasant emotions, anxiety, depression, or whatever pain they may be feeling. And here's a great example where you can be pursuing or taking action that on the outside looks identical, but the reason you're doing it may be entirely different. And there's the reason that determines the inner life state or world that's created. So, for example, if you are someone who really believes pleasure is happiness and you're addicted to alcohol, you're drinking not because you're trying to numb yourself. You're drinking because you really want to feel the pleasure of alcohol, or you want to smoke weed, or you want to, use drugs, whatever that may be. But if you are, for example, like Ash from the World of Tranquility, and you believe with all your heart that the key to happiness is avoiding all the pain you can, and you happen to be in a lot of pain, you may be doing the same exact thing as someone in the world of animality, but from a very different perspective and for a very different reason. And what you're looking for and what you think and what you feel and how your entire inner life state is entirely different because of the belief that's driving you. Even though the behavior looks the same, the belief is different.
Okay, I gotcha. So are the 10 worlds a continuum and where you move from, this is going to be a two-part question. So are they a continuum where you move from the first and ultimately to the 10th? And if that's true, Ash, how could you be from the world of tranquility? Because if you hold certain beliefs, like, don't you know those are a core delusion?
So first of all, I didn't know that it was my core delusion until I wrote this book. And
okay.
Surprised and disappointed to find out I was from there. But to get to your first question, it was a good one. So yes, you can move in and out of the worlds, and we actually can move in and out of them from moment to moment. But no, they're not. You don't move in them sequentially in any particular way. So you can move from one world to the other, but you don't have to go from one to the other to get to the next but you can find yourself going from the world of, I find myself going a lot of times from the world of tranquility, for example, to the world of hunger, which is the world where you believe the happiness comes from getting what you want. And those are the moments when you're kind of obsessed with getting something badly because you believe that you need to get it to be happy. So people can move from world to world based on what's happening in their lives or what belief is being, for whatever reason, stirred up by something that's happening in their environment. Well, we argue that everybody has kind of a core life, what we call a core life tendency, which is the world
Basic
you
life
feel
tendency.
the most. Basic life tendency, which is the world where you spend the most time and tend to revert to most of the time.
Okay, gotcha. And so within each world, is there a spectrum where something goes from constructive to destructive? Like I can see is wanting to get what you want, does that automatically prevent you from being enlightened? Or does wanting to get what you want to the exclusion of everything else prevent you from being enlightened?
That is an awesome and subtle question. And the answer is yes, there is a huge difference. And in each world, depending upon the context and the degree to which you're falling into it, can function positively or negatively. So, for example, in the world of hunger, we tend to be obsessed with what we want because we think if we can't get it, we can't be happy. And if you think about it, though, accomplishing a goal or a task or even a great dream requires a little bit of obsession, right? That's not a bad thing. Where you go wrong is if you think the entirety of your happiness is completely contained within you getting each and everything that you want in succession. And so that if you become obsessed with wanting this thing, like no, I have to get this job, or I have to get this partner, or whatever it is that you are obsessed with, all other things get excluded from that. You become so single-mindedly focused and feel like you can't be happy until that happens. And then what happens is you get it and you find it's not nearly as pleasurable or enjoyable as you thought, and you're on to the next thing. And so people in the world of hunger tend to never quite be satisfied. They're always happy to something. It's always going to happen to them one day or when I get this thing. But even in the world of hell, which is sort of the term we use for the life state of being, suffering, has positive aspects. If you're not in pain, if you're not suffering, sometimes you're not motivated, and you need that motivation, to, for example, seek to improve yourself or seek to improve your lot, whatever that may be. But even the other thing that to mention about this is that you never land in a world and stay there. Even in the world of enlightenment, you don't get to land there and just stay there. You have to continually, the higher worlds require effort to be there. The lower worlds are very easy to fall into. But if you're aiming at enlightenment, which we hope everybody after they read this book will want to, then that requires effort. And even when you have a fundamental insight and you attain enlightenment, is sort of the Buddhists have always talked about, it's always possible for you to fall back into the lower worlds, hell, or any of the other ones. So it's a continual, literally from moment to moment, you can filter through all the worlds very, very quickly. And where our argument here is that at every moment you are in one of these worlds, and you are, in your behavior and what you feel and what you think and what you believe is predictable based on that world, and it's a continual cycle we always go through.
But like when we talk about self-awareness, do you think about self-awareness, at least one part of it is, being able to see and acknowledge the world you're in at this moment?
Yeah, well, yes, in terms of understanding or awakening to the belief that keeps you there is kind of the way we talk about it. So in terms of, I was trained as a cognitive therapist among other things, and that paradigm was really about, people are really, their behaviors and everything they experience in their life to some degree is controlled by the beliefs they hold. A lot of them, or at least the most powerful ones, are those that are subconscious that they don't even realize have them in their grip. And so a large part of therapy, for example, was helping people understand or uncover or excavate, we used to call, what those beliefs are that have so much control over their lives, but they don't have access to. So awakening to that, or coming to understand your beliefs, we believe gives you significant power over them. So for me, for example, now understanding that I come from the Rule of Tranquility, and that more importantly, I believe that I have this delusion that, happiness comes from avoiding pain, which has before sort of paralyzed me with these big decisions, because I believe that, boy, I couldn't make the wrong decision because happiness was contained in it. Now that I know that, and I know that's a delusion, I approach decision making in a very different way, and I don't see the burden of it, and I kind of free myself from the anxiety of believing that my happiness is contained in that decision. So yeah, we believe as you understand your belief, you read this book and you can really relate to one of the worlds, and you can start uncovering that belief that you hold about what happiness is, it will lead you to be able to overcome it and not be in the grip of it all the time.
Okay, so one of the things that I've noticed about myself, and I try really hard not to do this anymore, and I'm curious, this sounds like hunger actually, but what I tend to do is I tend to set these, usually it's around some kind of ridiculous physical challenge. Like I ride a unicycle, like one wheel, so I rode it 100 miles this summer. And yeah, right? Like why would I, but what I notice about myself, and this was actually the thing that made me realize this, was that I get so focused on the actual achievement of the goal that I, first of all, don't enjoy the journey at all because I'm so worried about screwing up achieving the goal. And then the achievement of that moment when I cross the finish line is so pathetically fleeting that, and I realized that basically in that very moment, what am I doing here? Like this, I need to take a step back here and really focus on enjoying every step of the journey. But for me, one of the things I have this attachment, so I can look around in my life and that way of thinking, I can look and there's objective evidence that way of thinking about whatever I'm doing is never good enough. There's evidence that tells me that's probably working fairly well. Right. And I have this attachment to a fear or an attachment to the idea that way of thinking is getting me the things that I want in my life. And I feel like if I let it, I don't really feel this way anymore. I'm working through it, but I have for a long time felt that if I let that go, I'm basically just, again, I'm become a slothish couch potato. So is that hunger, or is that just basically psychosis?
No. In fact, you have completely nailed the life condition of hunger. That's exactly what it is. And yet, here's the thing, you don't, the idea is not that the life condition of hunger or wanting things is bad. The issue is if you think only that you can only be happy if you get what you want. Because if you're sitting there, what you just described is you're obsessed with finishing. Mm-hmm. You're so obsessed with it. It's so important to you because you can't enjoy the journey. But if you think about what you're saying is, why is it so important to you? It's so important to you because you believe as you're traveling that journey that to finish this is going to make you happy. There is no other motivation I can imagine that would make you so obsessed with that, right? And so, but if you really broke through that delusion and recognized, no, I don't need to do this to be happy. Like if I fail at this and I don't make it, in a week, I'm going to be on to the next thing. I'm going to be fine. And that belief, that understanding really penetrates down to your bones. So that you now realize I don't need to do this to be happy. That I would predict would free you to enjoy it. And so that when you got there, and also it would free you to really savor that ending, because part of what happens in the world of hunger is it becomes so important to you to accomplish that goal, for example, that you're describing. There is no way the actual accomplishment of the goal can live up to what you expect it to. It's such this buildup, like your entire happiness is riding on this. There's no way the joy you get from that is ever going to live up to that. So it's immediately disappointing. And then you don't get to savor it. And it's all based on that delusion, that core delusion that you have to get what you want. In this case, finish this race to be happy.
Yeah, that's pretty much sums me up to a T. So, okay, I have a question about curiosity and what the relationship is, if there is one, between being curious and being happy. Because I've noticed as I get older and I grow as a human being and I learn more, I become more and more curious about everything. I mean, I hold my opinions that I hold are held much less strongly than they used to be. I'm open to having my paradigms challenged, as uncomfortable as that might be sometimes. And I always try to lead in any kind of interaction with curiosity. And I notice I'm also way happier than I've ever been. Is there a connection between those two things, as you guys see it?
This is your world. This is Alex's world, so I'll let him take it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So absolutely. Curiosity is one of the most positive aspects of the world of learning. And so, from a really pragmatic perspective, curiosity well substitutes for a bunch of other attitudes that do not serve us well. For example, the need to be right. So when people are confronted with someone who behaves in a bizarre way that makes them angry, right? To approach those people not with anger yourself, but with curiosity is a much more emotionally healthy and productive way to view that. But even more basically, we are built with curiosity. We evolved the desire to be curious, and it really is a part of, as I said, the world of learning, whose core delusion is that in order to be happy, we have to create meaning with our lives. We have to do meaningful things. And I actually want to pause and just as a side note say we're calling these core delusions not because believing these things fails to make us happy. It does. Creating meaning makes people very happy. But it doesn't create the type of happiness we expect it to, which is permanent happiness. That's the delusional part. Because no matter how much meaning or value you create, no matter how many good works you do, no matter how much, how well and how often you express your values in a positive way, you have to keep doing it because, it's you finish it and it's satisfying and gives you joy, and then you're on to the next thing. Like any type of temporary happiness, it only lasts so long. But to get back to your original idea, curiosity is an incredibly positive and powerful driving force that I think if we felt more of, many more people would be happy.
Okay, understood. So one thing I wanted to touch on that you mentioned there was you talked about this idea of permanent happiness, but you've also talked about the fact that, you move in and out of worlds at this, in any given moment. So how are those two concepts? They don't seem reconcilable to me.
I'll start this one and Alex will finish it. So we do make a distinction in the book, particularly when we hit the world of rapture, about the difference between what we call relative happiness and absolute happiness. And so like Alex has mentioned, the types of happiness that you can achieve in some of these worlds is a very real happiness that feels good and joyful. And we, it's a great experience. But it's still a happiness that comes from some sort of attachment, whether it's something physical or something internal or something that's derived or something you create. And as long as it's dependent on some kind of attachment, it's going to be basically just relative or temporary happiness. Where we make the argument that there's a different type of happiness that doesn't come from a core delusion, but from a core truth, which I'll talk about, that then allows you to experience a different type of happiness, what we call absolute happiness. That's a very different experience. So it's not that they're not reconcilable. It's that you can't experience them at the same time, and it's a different experience of happiness that most people don't really even understand or know well enough to pursue, which Alex can get into.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that the reason that the 10 worlds are discussed in the order that we do is because the degree of relative happiness you feel begins to increase the higher up the ladder you go. So hell is that's the life condition of suffering. That's where there's no happiness whatsoever. And hunger is really, in a sense, the life condition of pain. It's not quite as bad as suffering. Pain and suffering, we delineate as very different things. in the book, and that's a little better, all the way up to say rapture, which is where you are feeling joy, temporary joy in response to having gained an attachment. And then the higher worlds, which are learning and realization and compassion, it's still about attachment, and it's still a relative happiness, meaning that it is temporary, but it is a greater degree of happiness, a greater degree of relative happiness that you have in the lower worlds. So that's all relative. Absolute happiness, what we believe is that, this notion of enlightenment, which is for most people this far away, even mystical state that maybe we don't even believe is possible. There's been actually a number of research studies done recently that suggest that not only is it possible, it's something that throughout history, people have described achieving and feeling. In fact, actually, I tell individual stories we've had ourselves where we had temporary glimpses of this state. And there's actually some fascinating neuroscience that is now describing what happens when people enter this state. And what we argue is there may be more than one way to get there, but what it really comes down to is not having something, not having an attachment, but actually learning to perceive the world in a particular way. And it is that perception that gives rise to a core belief that when that belief gets stored up, it causes you to enter into this life state where you are supremely joyful no matter what's happening in your life, no matter what tragedy may have befallen you, no matter what attachment you may have lost.
Man, that is so fascinating. So we'll get into enlightenment in a minute. But one thing I was curious about as it relates to core delusions are those core delusions a symptom of or a part of Western culture, or do they span cultures, or is it part of our history right now, or are they innate?
That they are innate, and in terms of they're a core part of being human. I mean, again, that's we don't have any hard clinical evidence to that we're presenting, but what we have leveraged is a combination of clinical observation, thousands of years of philosophical observation, and lots of current science neurology, and we actually do believe that these 10 beliefs are what represent the entirety of all beliefs about happiness of humanity, not a particular culture or particular religion or anything like that at all. Now, you could argue that culture plays a role in which beliefs might be more strongly held than others in terms of how the value systems that might be ingrained or some aspect of religious belief that might influence it. I would completely concede that that's probably very possible, that you might have a tendency towards one versus the other, whether you're in a society that values physical possessions versus other societies that might value more human connections, etc. That clearly plays a role, but we haven't studied this enough to be able to tell you, empirically or with any kind of reliability what that looks like.
Okay, what do you see as the relationship, or maybe a better way of asking it is, how do you see philosophy informing science, and has your perspective on that changed as you've gotten older? Like, did you come from a strictly scientific background and become more interested in philosophy as you got older, or how did that work?
That is a great question. There's been a lot written recently that I've been reading about the relationship between philosophy and science. And, it used to be that when science was just in its infancy, it was all philosophy, right? It was thinking about how the universe might work, reasoning from first principles, using logic, even mathematics to sort of, figure out how things should be. And I think what's happened is that science has advanced and has gradually encroached on the realm of philosophy and sort of taken away a lot of, or answered, I should say, a lot of philosophical questions. I'll give you an example. This is still, to some degree, debatable whether or not we have free will. And that has, up until very recently, been entirely in the realm of philosophy. But in fact, there are neuroscience studies suggesting we don't have free will that are quite compelling to suggest we don't have free will. Studies by a guy named Benjamin Libet, who actually was able to show that almost a full second before a person becomes consciously aware of their intention to move their finger, there is firing in the part of the brain, in the motor cortex, that moves the finger. And so this notion of self and self-governance and free will is really, which has traditionally been in a philosophical question, is now becoming a scientific question. In fact, we talk about this in the book, not so much from the perspective of free will or not, but in the perspective of what is the self and how does the self, relate to happiness and the decisions that we make. And so I actually think that science follows philosophical principles in its basic workings. The notion of falsifiability, right? You cannot, if you have a proposition, a hypothesis, and there is no way to design an experiment to disprove it, then you're talking about something that's not in the realm of science. That's a philosophical notion, right? And I think that serves science very well. So I think there's still a marriage between those two, but frankly, I think the questions philosophy has always tried to answer, as we progress in science, we're going to be able to answer them with empirical data.
Yeah, so let's talk about the self, because I find that concept very interesting. I mean, my I would say exploration to this has basically been trying to understand the untethered soul. I don't know if you've ever read that book by Michael Singer, but he talks a lot about the self, and listening to Sam Harris and stuff like that. But yeah, so I mean, when you think of the self, I mean, you guys, how do you describe it?
Yeah, I want to take this one.
Yeah, so it's an evolving understanding, but there's been some fascinating research, and again in brain science. And there's a guy named a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, who actually has talked with Sam Harris. They have a blog or a podcast they did, and he makes the argument in a book called "Self Comes to Mind" that there are actually different levels of the self. There are, in fact, he delineates 3 selves, which are sort of concentrically arranged in the brain. The first he calls the core self, and he actually spends a large part of his book arguing the data to suggest this core self is actually located in the brainstem. And it actually is a very rudimentary self, and it is the self from which true self-awareness erupts. And then after that, he talks about something called the Proto self, where that's the second layer of self that actually comes into being when the core self interacts with the environment. And then finally, there's something called the autobiographical self. And what's fascinating about this is that there are these really unfortunate children who are literally born without a cerebral cortex. And that is where the thinking now is that the autobiographical self, which is the self that can envision a future, that hungers for happiness, that is self-aware, actually resides. And there's evidence for the 2 lower levels of self, because these children will still react to their environment in a way that shows they have desires, that shows they actually have some rudimentary type of identity. This theory also, by the way, explains how animals, for example, can have a certain dimension of self. In other words, the self is not either there or not there. There are degrees of selfhood, and it is based on the neural circuitry that has evolved in different animals. And so the autobiographical self, we think, plays a crucial role in the notion of enlightenment. And so we could talk about that as well, but that's how we think about the self. So, Sam Harris, I know, for example, argues, and many meditators argue, that the self is an illusion. And I don't agree with that. I think that the sense of self is very real. What's an illusion is the notion that we have a fixed self, that there's some unchanging part of ourselves, the core essence of our being. We have a strong sense that that's the case, and that sense is actually fixed throughout our lives. But the self itself is not fixed, if that makes sense.
My mind is blown. Yeah, for sure. So you said that there's a relationship between the way you guys describe self, the sense of self, and enlightenment. So I guess as we get into enlightenment here, I mean, that's a very I don't know if it's a loaded word, but I mean, it's certainly a word that's been used a lot throughout history. So is the way you guys think about enlightenment in alignment with some of the, principles of Buddhism, say, for example, or are you defining it in some new way?
The answer is both. So it is indeed in alignment with many of the notions of Buddhism, but sort of Buddhism minus all of the mystical aspects. One of the main points we wanted to make in the book about enlightenment was that it is not a mystical experience, that it is divorced from the need to believe in any religious principle or practice or religious practice, I suppose. But the Buddhists really were very early to this. They recognized that there was an internal life state that could be attained that would, in a sense, free people from their earthly desires, that was a higher life state, so to speak, that contained this indestructible happiness that we're talking about. And science is beginning to catch up and actually identify what this is. And in fact, one of the points we make in the book is that throughout all of human history, different cultures, different time periods, there has always been someone writing about this state. And the way they describe this state of enlightenment, they may not have used that term, But when you look at their description, it's almost identical to every other description throughout history. And that to me was a clue that this is a state that is built on our brains, that there is neurology involved here. The same way all people throughout all of history have been angry, right? We don't say anger is a cultural phenomenon. It's a neurologic phenomenon. It's a mental phenomenon. We're arguing that so is enlightenment. And you're right, enlightenment is maybe too charged a word, but it does in fact describe what we think this state is like. And in fact, what Ash and I both had brief glimpses of as the state being like.
So one of the things you mentioned earlier, and I've read this too, and I think it's a really challenging thing for people to wrap their head around, is that, that you can be happy even in the midst of tragedy, right? Like the loss of a spouse or a child, for example, in an extreme case. And, it's interesting because my wife right now her mother is dying of cancer. She's probably got a couple of weeks left. And it's been a really interesting experience to watch both of them, mostly my wife, go through this, because I think something that she's done really, that's been a really powerful tool for her is she's freed herself from, the attachment to the stories we tell ourselves about how we're supposed to feel when someone close to us dies. Like I know I had a similar situation where my first wife took her own life, and I put myself through so much misery by judging how I was supposed to be feeling. And it was always the opposite of how I was actually feeling. Like, so when the moment I found out, that evening, I didn't cry at all. And I was thinking to myself, like, what the fuck is wrong with me that I'm not like, am I some emotionless automaton here that I'm not crying? And then other times I'd be, very emotional, and then I'd be labeling myself as weak. So really there was no relief for me. But anyways, my point in saying all that is that she has recognized, I think it's quite insightful that, these stories all this stuff is socially constructed. And so she knows that there will be times where she does feel sad, I guess. And there's times that she won't. And I think it's been a really helpful thing. But what I hear you saying, and I've heard other people say about enlightenment, is that even in the midst of something like that, it is still possible to be happy. So, and I think a lot of people would go like, what the hell are you talking about?
So let me talk about it in terms of, from a psychological perspective, that what you're describing actually is what set me on the path trying to understand this better. And then maybe Alex can talk about it a little bit from how you experience these tragedies in life in the world of enlightenment, which does not mean you cannot feel sadness. It doesn't mean you can't feel all these things. It's just how that experience, the level of suffering it causes you is, I think, what's different. But I'll tell you, what you're describing in terms of how different you can have different reactions based on facing tragedy. I mean, honestly, what set me on the path to want to write this book is when I was a clinical psychologist, I was just struck by the fact that the same exact external event had profoundly different impacts on people based on what I now believe is, based on their beliefs about their beliefs. So it could be something as simple as a guy gets dumped by his girlfriend. I've seen it send people to literally years of depression. And I've seen other people take that and say as a massive opportunity for personal growth to understand how they can become better at relationships. Same exact event. For one person, it ignites a tremendous amount of personal growth. For one person, it sends them into hell for years. Why? Right? So, I do think that the ability to take some tragedy in your life and have it function in different ways is fundamentally what we're talking about here in terms of how to achieve more happiness that endures. I'll let Alex talk about how do we talk about experiencing these things from a life condition of enlightenment.
Well, before I do that, I want to just make a comment about what you said, which is brilliant in the sense that your wife is allowing herself not to be influenced by the narratives that that make her feel like she should feel a particular thing, and how you yourself got wrapped up in that and judged yourself so harshly for that. I think we do that constantly. We don't just have feelings; we judge ourselves for our feelings, and have feelings about the feelings we're having based on those judgments. And it's kind of a core aspect of the world of tranquility to try to take all those feelings that we're having and push them away, and then to judge ourselves harshly when we have them, because to some degree, any negative feelings represent pain. We don't want to feel those. So I was just finishing up about the world of tranquility, where you're trying to suppress negative emotions, but positive emotions get wrapped up in that as well. And we also end up judging ourselves for those emotions because we pay attention to the narratives about how we think we're supposed to feel. And I think, it is the definition of emotional health where we can allow ourselves to feel what we feel without judgment. That, we create so much misery for ourselves from trying to suppress our feelings or judging our feelings. So I think your wife, obviously just intuitively, has really figured out something crucially important. That's, however, very different from experiencing a loss from the perspective of someone in the life condition of enlightenment. And the thing that doesn't seem to happen in enlightenment is suffering. But pain happens quite a bit. And the difference, I should say, is, so the way we define the difference is pain is at its core any unpleasant sensation. It could be an unpleasant emotional sensation, an unpleasant physical sensation, which by definition, unpleasant, something we want to get away from. It is aversive to us. Suffering, on the other hand, is a response to pain. It is the experience, the feeling of being overwhelmed by pain. And you can quickly even just imagine the difference by imagining, if, for example, if you have a headache, there are some headaches for people who get headaches where, yeah, this hurts, I don't like it, but I'm functioning, I'm tolerating it, it's okay. And then headaches that pass a certain threshold where you don't feel you can function and it's really making you suffer. It's stopping you in its tracks. It's making you feel like you can do nothing about it, and it is causing suffering. So the life condition of enlightenment is so joy-filled that suffering does not enter the picture. But pain does, because in the world of enlightenment, it doesn't mean suddenly you lose interest or connection to your attachments, that people who were important to you before are suddenly not important and that everything is okay. That's not how we conceive of enlightenment. In fact, if anything, you become even more attached to the good things in your life and enjoy them more fully and mourn them very strongly when you lose them, but from the perspective only of feeling pain. And it's bittersweet that, on the one hand, your wife would greatly mourn the loss of her mother, but from the perspective of enlightenment would understand that, this is the way of life, that we lose everything to which we are attached and still even enjoy it somehow because of the unfettered transcendent joy that accompanies the life condition of enlightenment.
That's really interesting. I guess I wasn't thinking about attachment that way because in your worldview, are you saying that is your belief that people who are enlightened, they don't have attachments, or they do have attachments, or what does attachment mean? I guess.
Right. No, they do have attachment. In fact, but it's the things they become attached to are different than the things that people. So, for example, someone in the world of anger is attached to feeling superior and attached to things that make them feel that way, attached to competition and to beating other people. Someone in the world of enlightenment is attached to helping other people become happy, is attached to alleviating suffering where they find it, and has the wisdom to hang on to their attachments with exactly the right degree of connection. And when they can do nothing to hang on to their attachments, are able to let them go peacefully. Not without sadness, not without suffering, not without pain, but in a way that they are fully accepting and understanding of it. And so it's a difficult difference to explain if you haven't experienced what that life condition is like. But it's very real. Ash and I are not the only two people on the planet who've experienced this clearly. And so we contend everyone can experience this life condition, and that there could be no greater goal than to establish that life condition as your basic life tendency and go through life that way. But that doesn't mean you stop loving your loved ones, caring about what happens in the world. In fact, if anything, you care more, because what matters most to you, what you're most attached to in the life condition of enlightenment, is the happiness of other people.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, one thing I've often wondered about is and this might be slightly off topic, but we're always told, I don't know, the idea of fighting for what you want, right? I mean, is that antithetical to the idea of enlightenment?
No, not at all. Because what you want is to help other people around you who are suffering become happy? Someone who's enlightened is fighting for wise things. But and fighting for what you want, again, that may sound like you're kind of going back to the world of hunger, but you're not, because someone in the world of enlightenment can fight for what they want with every bit as much zeal and even obsessiveness as someone in the world of hunger. The difference is, the person in the world of enlightenment who's fighting for this thing does not believe that they have to get it to be happy. And that makes all the difference.
Okay. Wow. That's hugely insightful for me. So, God, yeah, I've read so many books on this, and you just explained it in a way that just made more sense to me than any of them. So, yeah, that's fantastic. So, one thing I'm curious about is when you look at the way we raise children today in our society. I mean, I guess maybe it's a two-part question. What are we doing what are we teaching them that is contributing to them holding these core delusions? And what might we do differently?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Because more often than not, you could argue that if a parent is coming from a particular world, that no matter what you tell your kids, that's what they're seeing, that's what they're internalizing. I can tell you that my kids clearly see that I'm from the world of tranquility, and I'm sure are internalizing some of that. And I think that there's a very I would argue that there's somewhat of a fairly natural life stage aspect to what world you're from. Like, I don't know if anybody knows any kids who are not from the world of animality, where they believe pleasure and happiness are the same thing, and they're little pleasure seekers, right? So, I think that for me, what people can do is start to help their kids understand that the happiness their happiness or even their joy doesn't have to only come from having things or attachments to different things. And in that sense, you have to sort of focus on the things that they care about, right? Like, I don't have to debate with my kid that I want him to be more attached to creating meaning rather than binge watching or playing video games, right? So I think that we do them a favor by actually just exposing them to the different ways and that they can think about what happiness means. I don't. My personal belief is you don't necessarily have to sit there and help them on the path towards enlightenment, but I think you can help them on the path to learning that they can gain joy from various and different things other than just pleasure or just getting what they want or all the things that most kids think about in the lower world, and exposing them to that. I think if we can do more of that and teach kids about happiness from helping others or happiness from creating something meaningful at an earlier and earlier age, you start helping them transform how they think about what it means to be happy. And I think it serves them well and maybe opens their mind to a greater type of happiness down the road.
I don't think there's anything we can do to teach people not to believe these core delusions, because they are so fundamentally part of our brains and our early upbringing. I mean, there's no one who doesn't believe at some level pleasure equals happiness, who hasn't had an experience with pleasure and felt that that was a desirable thing to have. And we are social creatures. We compete with one another. There's people have an innate desire to feel special, to feel superior to others. There's an innate will toward meaning. We have an innate altruistic nature and derive satisfaction and joy from helping other people. These are, the reason we settled on these as the core delusions, because they really seem to be just wired into us. But I agree with Ash that the real answer is, and the reason we wrote this book is to make people aware of this, to take these, shine a light on these beliefs and show people we are all believing these things, and to become conscious of them is the first step to gaining control over them.
Awesome. Yeah. My daughter, whenever I even bring up something like this, she gives me, I mean, you don't say talk to the hand anymore. That's like something from like the early 2000s, but she just automatically labels it as spiritual talk and like wants none of it. So
yeah,
it's seed planting. Parenting is seed planting.
It is.
So I guess maybe one last question I'll ask you guys is maybe I have two questions actually. So the first is, do you prescribe specific steps or tactics or whatever the word is for moving? Like, are they world specific? So if I want to, I recognize that I'm in this world, I want to move to another world. Is there a specific set of things or ways of thinking I need to do to go from that world to the next? Or are they, I guess they probably would be world specific now that I'm saying it out loud.
Yeah, I can start with Alex. So look, I haven't, as much as I would love down the road to formulate an entire psychological paradigm of treatment around this concept. Our starting point is by helping people just awaken to their beliefs about what they believe happiness to be, and then and the roadmap of how they what they do with that is starts becoming something they have to sort of own. And so for me, the journey for how I talk to people about this is more around gaining wisdom. And we talk a lot about that in the book, that one of the roads to happiness is acquiring wisdom, and wisdom about your own life and your own nature and your own beliefs is what we want to awaken people here to. we haven't thought about it, at least I haven't thought about it yet in a highly prescriptive manner in terms of somebody from this world, needs this sort of treatment. Somebody from this world needs this. Now, clearly, the worlds and the delusions themselves sort of lend themselves to some. If you go in the extreme, it starts getting into pathology that I do know how to treat. So, for example, the world of animality leads to a lot of addiction, and yes, there are treatments that are known to deal with weight issues or drug issues or alcohol issues, and that's there. But you start getting into the other worlds, which can manifest themselves in all kinds of different ways. Now, ironically, Jason, that this whole book is written based on clinical cases. So what you can actually watch unfold in each chapter is how I treated each of these patients and how Alex and I sort of tried to figure out what their roadmap to success is. So there might be clues in there in all the different clinical cases of what people might need to awaken to help themselves out of a particular world.
Okay, I got it. So I guess my last question is actually for you, Ash. What made you decide to get into marketing?
Yeah. Well, look, I honestly, it was somewhat of a opportunistic and coincidental path. I was a clinical psychologist in practicing in school, doing my internship. I started doing some focus groups on the side to make a little extra money so I can go out and buy some ramen noodles. And I started finding that I just was fascinating with the application of psychology to the world of, marketing, product development, and realized that marketing is really a psychological paradigm. Is how do you manipulate people to buy your product? And so I just found myself being drawn more and more into that. And then found myself sort of transitioning, always thinking at some point in my life that I would probably come back to it, and that's why I still maintain my license. And this book has been kept my one foot planted pretty firmly in this space. So you never know when I might come back to it.
Okay, awesome. I'm kind of feeling all of a sudden like you might have something to do with the fact that these Fitbits are showing up on Amazon.
Yeah,
but I don't have any evidence, so it's just a hunch. So listen, guys, this has been great. Has there been anything that we haven't covered that you feel like is important to cover before we sign off?
No, boy, you really did a great job of teasing out.
I would just say that if people, a good start to this road is to go to our website, which is the10worlds.com, and take this little. You took it. Apparently, clearly, you took it.
I did.
And then you can read a little bit about the world, see what it means, and if it really resonates with you or piques your curiosity, then obviously you can read the book. But I've had everybody in my office sort of take it, and it's been fascinating to watch light bulbs come on, and the discussion that it's engendered, and the self-reflection that just that simple 3 minutes has generated here. It's been really inspiring and fascinating.
You want to say that it's a self-assessment tool. You didn't say that. That's on the website. Yeah, to figure out what world you're in.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, so I'll include the links to all that stuff in the show notes page. And listen, guys, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a fascinating conversation, and you've really helped me. I've learned a lot, so I'm very grateful.
It was fantastic talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Like, first of all, I love the way those guys riff on each other like that. Usually I was a little concerned when we did the podcast because having three people on, I mean, I've tried to do, when we first started the Mental Health Warriors podcast, we had two hosts, and I found it hard to get the flow right. And these guys did a great job. I mean, they've obviously done this many times before, but yeah, it was the way they riffed off each other and knew each other's timings and, flipped the ball over to each other back and forth, I thought was really great. But on top of all that, I mean, what a cool conversation. And, for everybody out there that's, wondering why it is that the things that you're doing aren't producing the happiness that you want, no matter how hard you try. I mean, give this podcast a listen. I mean, if you're listening to this part of the podcast, it's the end. So you either jumped right to the end, like my daughter does with her books, or you listen to it. So, but anyways, if you know some friends, some people you care about, and I'm sure you do, who are going about trying to pursue happiness all the wrong way and laboring under these core delusions, send them this way to the show because I think it could really help them. And in the meantime, I'm going to continue my quest to become enlightened, and I expect it to happen never. But I'm going to continue the quest, and I'm going to enjoy every minute of it. So hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to many more to come. There's got some great, great guests coming up. And thank you for listening to the Inquisitive Souls podcast, where we lead with curiosity and empathy, and we try to stimulate amazing connecting and transformative conversations. And if you want to find out more, please look up the Inquisitive Souls page on Facebook or send me a message on Facebook and I'll always respond to you. We'd love your feedback on how to make this show better and to learn how to help you have better conversations. Until next time, my friends.